Backyard Green Films is proud to present this episode of Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Alara and her husband Rick travel throughout the land in their teardrop trailer that they have nicknamed Maggie, bringing you stories about their travels and the people they meet. They visit farmers, ranchers, and just about anyone who loves putting their hands in the dirt or their feet in stirrups. In those travels, they have gotten to meet some very interesting people. Here's one of those interviews.
Hi, this is Alara. Welcome back to our Agri-Culture podcast. I don't know if you've been reading or watching the news lately, but you'd have to be living in a cave to miss the news of the latest infection that's running amok in humanity. That's said with a great big dose of irony, because it doesn't really matter what day or year you're hearing about the latest epidemic or pandemic. That phrase is pretty much true no matter what decade or century you've lived in. Maybe it's viral, maybe it's bacterial, but however it spreads, something is floating around that we're going to have to battle. We use the term epidemic and pandemic to describe fast-moving disease outbreaks, but the big one we really get worried about is the pandemic. That's the one that doesn't stop at a border, and it usually spreads across continents or across the globe. It used to take a while for something to hit the other side of the globe, but not anymore. Modern transportation has changed all of that in a fundamental way. In the year 2020, the disease hitting the news is the coronavirus, or COVID-19. In the 80s, it was HIV and AIDS. In 1918, it was the Spanish flu, although to my understanding, it was called the Spanish flu because that was one of the few countries who would actually talk about it. How's that for a thank you? But things keep rolling our way constantly. SARS, MERS, Ebola, malaria, leprosy, Zika. And then there's the really nasty ones from all of those old period movies, usually with the word plague in there somewhere. Bubonic, typhoid, smallpox. Is your skin crawling yet? Aha! The skin crawling part is actually pretty important, so we've learned. It took us a couple of thousand years to truly get the picture on this one. But sometimes the crawling feeling is not, just because the idea of big nasty oozing sores is making us feel gross. Sometimes there are actually crawly things that are bringing the bad news to us. Rodents and the fleas they carry bring us the bubonic plague, or hantavirus, or leptospirosis. Thank you, mosquitoes, for malaria and Zika. And the list goes on and on. Now you might be asking yourself why on earth I'm bringing all of this to this particular podcast. Is it newsworthy? Yes. Is it educational? Yes. But related to agriculture? Definitely yes. Wait. Huh? Well, first of all, there's the dirt part, where the forest clearing for whatever purpose, farming or otherwise, is connecting previously untouched areas to the population. Things brought into our sphere that were safely buried for centuries, usually for the purpose of raising food or catching food or something like that. We commonly associate this as a people problem, bushmeat, or different types of animals that bring human diseases for us to combat. And that's true to a big extent, I'm sure. But whether or not most people are aware of it, agricultural animals have been going through the same problems we have. The losses follow similar patterns to our disease outbreaks, but when agricultural animals get hit, it's often euthanasia for all. Farming livelihoods and years of effort for breeding stock is just gone. And these diseases can be really bad. If you have poultry, for instance, there are a few words that can strike fear into a chicken person's heart. Marek's disease, avian influenza, avian sarcoma leucosis virus or lymphoid leucosis, viral arthritis, pox. They get the one called fowl pox instead of chicken or smallpox, but it's kind of in the same ballpark. And the really terrifying one in California this year, Newcastle disease. The first version of Newcastle apparently wasn't bad enough, so the universe brought us Newcastle 2.0, or virulent Newcastle. Even if the disease weren't highly contagious and 100% lethal, it might as well be, as any chickens in a quarantined area were subject to mandatory euthanasia and destruction. Yes, that is the poultry pets too. VR still has much of Southern California under mandatory lockdown, so no shipping, transporting, chick or chicken swapping, sales, or any other chicken thing until the all clear is sounded by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Does this sound familiar? Those are the common poultry viruses that you might think about. There are bacterial ones too, but they sound pretty nasty just pronouncing the words, so I'm not going to subject you to that. The humans and other animals have company together with the skin crawly issue and the diseases that come with that. Those little bugs and what they carry can work just like rodents and the fleas and the plague with people. I can personally tell you that if there's a hell somewhere, I hope it's uncomfortable, and I hope all northern fowl mites, red poultry mites, and stick-tide fleas reside there after a deservedly painful demise. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Some poultry parasites are related to lice, if those of you with kids want a frame of reference for how joyous those are to eliminate. Well, I guess I'm just like all the rest of the humans insofar as the disease thing is concerned. For my hubby and I and our little farm, I just want to educate myself on what's out there and try to avoid it or take care of it once it's here. Just tell me how to do that, please. With so much information out there, who's the guy I'm supposed to trust to get solid and reliable information? A scientist. And why? Not because he has all the answers immediately. Not because he'll always tell me what I want to hear. But because most scientists spend their lives doing something that's sometimes exciting, sometimes dangerous, and often incredibly boring and monotonous work, to understand things. Not the pretend understanding, just so you'll look smart. The man we bring to you today was a person we very much wanted to interview, and not because his work was specifically pertaining to agriculture, but because we wanted him to try to explain to us the general concept. How are diseases spread in animals and people? He is a brilliant scientist that spent most of his work life in virology, recently specializing in arthropod-related blood-borne viruses. That means things like mosquitoes, ticks, and midges to the average Joe. He calls them a word I still have to write phonetically to pronounce: hemotophagus. While we interviewed Dr. Charles Calisher in Fort Collins, Colorado, we did so for a few reasons. First, there are very few things on the planet that I find uninteresting in the science world. A specialist in blood-borne disease transmission with so many interesting things on his resume is very much closer to the top of my interesting list than the bottom. His recent studies are formative in our understanding of the hantavirus and how it spreads. But his history also includes the National Institute of Health, USDA, CDC, Fort Collins, and CSU, and on and on. The day we spoke to Dr. Calisher was one of the most surreal days of my life, on the day after the 2017 total eclipse in North America, where we hit the line of totality in Casper, Wyoming, and then drove like mad for Fort Collins. The next morning, on very little sleep, we met with this incredibly brilliant, slightly crotchety, scientifically exacting man. He and his lovely wife graciously allowed us into their home, and he somewhat graciously let me pick his brain for 2 hours. Just kidding. He was much more patient than I deserve with that level of coffee in me. But when I think of him now, in my head, I still say, "Sir." I bet his lab assistants are still doing the same. Here is the amazing Dr. Charles Calisher.
My name is Charles Calisher. I'm Professor Emeritus in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Pathology at Colorado State University.
So, if you would please tell me what your field of study is called and what is involved in that.
Well, kind of generally it's virology, study of viruses, but I've specialized for 40 years on arthropod-borne viruses, mosquito-borne, tick-borne viruses, culicoid-borne viruses, midges, and how they are transmitted and what kind of diseases they cause and how to diagnose them and so on. But more recently, I've been working with rodent-borne viruses, which is the same thing. A rodent's just a big mosquito.
So if you would please correctly pronounce for me arboviruses and what a hematophagous or hemophagus, however you would say
Hematophagus.
Okay, say this again, please.
Hematophagus.
Okay, if
Blood
you could explain
feeding.
that concept, please.
arboviruses, not arborviruses. They were originally called arboviruses because it was a condensation of three words, arthropod-borne viruses. And then somebody said arbo is trees, and this has nothing to do with trees. So they cut out the R and it made it arbovirus. It means arthropod-borne viruses, and they're transmitted by blood-feeding insects, such as mosquitoes and ticks and culicoids.
This category can be applied to both human and animal transmissions?
Livestock, wildlife, birds, rodents, mammals of all kinds, bats.
Is there a difference in how viruses are transmitted through arthropods in people and animals, or is it, and livestock animals, or is it the same concept both ways?
It's the same. Insect feeds on a human and transmits the virus while they're drawing blood. Only the females take blood. Male don't feed on blood. They feed on plants. And it doesn't matter if they feed on a human or they feed on a cow or a chicken or a rat.
Are there some diseases that can only be transmitted from the arthropod to a person, but not to another animal?
Not that I know of. But there are plenty of viruses that have been found in arthropods that are not known to infect anything. They must infect. That's just the lack of research studies. Or we know that one or two people have acquired some disease, a mild disease, a 3-day fever with rash or no rash, just a little fever, or a very mild illness. Nobody's going to put a lot of money into studying that, so we don't know. And there are obviously lots of diseases in non-human vertebrates, and they are not known to cause diseases in humans. That may be because humans aren't susceptible, or because the virus was not transmitted by circumstance. Animals off in some place where humans don't go, or not many humans go, or humans go and they get antibody to it and they're no longer susceptible to it. It's very complicated.
I think that the layperson doesn't truly understand, including me, doesn't truly understand transmission and how it differs from animal to animal and from animal to human. So if you had to explain to people one of the more important things that you would like them to understand about transmission, what would it be, the layperson?
It would be that it's extremely complicated and generalities are not real helpful. You have to talk about the individual virus, and there may be lots of viruses that are transmitted the same way, but maybe by different insects. Or there may be a lot of different viruses or similar viruses that are transmitted by different insects, or different viruses that are transmitted by the same insect. So, for example, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes are capable of transmitting yellow fever, the 4 dengue viruses, Zika, chikungunya, and so on. And you can have dual infections. Maybe 3 viruses can infect the same mosquito. That depends on the population density, human population density, and the time of year, and oh my God, it's really complicated. So you have to study one virus at a time.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you was about population density and the increase in the last
Human population density?
Yes, 100 or 200 years in the human population on the planet.
We know that once you get an outbreak of a virus in a densely populated area, it spreads very quickly unless something's done. In an area where there are not many people, low population density, it either spreads slowly or it dies out because it's not transmitted. It isn't the mosquito that's the problem. It's the virus that's the problem. But if you don't have the mosquitoes, the virus doesn't get transmitted.
So, with something that might be commonly that the population may have heard of, like Zika, could you explain how that starts with the mosquito, goes to people, and then is transmitted from there? Just the basic overview.
Well, let's say that you have an infected. It depends anywhere you want to start. If you have an infected human who comes into an area where there's no Zika, and the mosquitoes are there, and the mosquitoes are susceptible to infection, and they feed on that person who is infected, and they pick up the virus. 1 mosquito or 10 mosquitoes or 100 mosquitoes, depending on where they are. Those mosquitoes then go out, female mosquitoes, take what we call a blood meal, and they lay eggs. They may take another blood meal, and since they're infected now, when they take that second blood meal, they infect the people they feed on, and it just multiplies.
At that point in time, it's my understanding that it can then be passed from human to human in many cases. Is that correct?
No.
They did say that sexual transmission was one of the theories as
Yeah.
to how but that's human to human transfer.
Yeah. It's rare, but it's certainly possible. The first evidence of that was here at CSU. We had one of our entomologists went to Africa to do some studies of malaria, came back and didn't feel well. Wasn't terribly sick, but he didn't feel well. And he had a rash, and he had a fever and a headache, and so on and so forth. And then his wife got Zika from him. Sexual transmission. Now it's been shown all over the place. Also, it's transmitted, it is found in urine, which is not a great route of transmission. But we don't know enough about it, but it isn't transmitted by breathing or touching someone. It has to be pretty intimate contact.
Now, actually, I want to pursue something that you just said in terms of transmission through urine. Could you explain the Hunter virus with regard to the transmission between rodents and the wet season, and how the urine transfer is important in that scenario?
An infected rodent, and this becomes extremely complicated as to how the rodents themselves become infected. Let's start with newborn rodents. So if you have a female who is not infected, her offspring will not get antibody from her from breastfeeding. So they stay clean. Then into the nest comes an infected male, let's say. And to show who's in charge, urinates on everything, like dogs do. The female probably won't get infected because there's an age susceptibility to it. So it doesn't matter whether she does or not. The young can get infected. They have no antibody from her. When they get infected when they're very young, they probably maintain that virus infection all their lives. So even when they're old enough to get ready to die, they've got virus in the lungs, the kidney, the spleen, and because they have it in the kidney, they're shedding it in the urine. And so when they go out, they can urinate on all kinds of things and spread it that way. If they fight male rodents, susceptible species, not all rodents are susceptible, male rodents will fight for females, for space, territory, and for food. And they can transmit the virus that way. Unless they're fighting with an animal that's already infected or has antibody. Now, if the female in the nest, going back in the nest, is infected and or was infected and is no longer infectious, she's going to produce antibody in her milk and feed the young animals antibody. So if a male comes in who is infected and urinates on things, they're not going to get infected. They're already immune. But it's passive immunity. It's not from an infection. It's passive immunity from her. They grow up and go out in the world, and that maternal antibody, immunity from maternal antibody, wanes. And they pretty soon don't have any antibody because it never was theirs, it was hers in the first place. Probably wouldn't last more than a month. They might get infected, but they wouldn't be infected for life like they would when they're infected when they're very young. They get infected, they make antibody, they may or may not shed virus, or if they shed it, it's not for a very long time, and all is then well. So it depends on the age when they get infected, who infects them, whether they have antibody in the first place, whether they don't have antibody. It's a complex picture.
Does it kill the mice?
What?
The hantavirus?
No. They don't die from it. There's some evidence that they don't grow to the same maximum that uninfected animals do, and they don't live quite as long, maybe a month less, but those are statistical oddities, I think. They don't keel over and die, that's for sure. And if you take one of these animals, kill it, take out the lungs, the kidney, the spleen, the liver, you get virus. And they're happy. They were happy. Till you cut them open.
Viruses are extremely common, and that what you just described about the mice carrying this throughout their lifetime can happen in humans too. I've had shingles explained to me as a variant of the chicken pox. That once someone has chicken pox when they're young, it stays latent in their spine.
Right.
And then
not
later,
in their spine.
Where does it stay?
Don't know.
System, but it stays latent in the person, and then they can have viral outbreaks at a later time that are not the same as the original outbreak, but they may be a cold sore, shingles, ocular herpes, that type of thing. Would you explain how that is similar? If I could get you on camera, kind of explaining that.
That's a very complicated picture. Also, you can have a grandmother who had chicken pox when she was 5. And is now 80, and she goes into her grandchild's class to talk about the old days and the log cabin she grew up in and so on, and they all get chicken pox. She's got shingles and can spread it. It's a nasty disease. Shingles is a painful disease. Chicken pox can be bad, usually treated well, but it can cause encephalitis, varicella virus. It's the same virus. It's a herpes virus.
In the descriptions of viruses that you've given, I'm not going to grant that they have intelligence, but viruses seem to be very good at adapting and evolving to survive.
Yeah. Bacteria too. Parasites too. I mean, you can come up with antibiotics treat diseases successfully, and all of a sudden it's not successful anymore, and you got to go to another antibiotic, and we're going to run out of them.
Now the first
Tuberculosis, by the way, is a perfect example of that. There's antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis.
one of the diseases that comes to mind for me is the flu. The Spanish flu in 1918 killed a large chunk of the population. But how different is that? If you could explain the flu virus and how it is mutated over time, how it's evolved over time.
I'm no expert on influenza viruses, but there are lots of influenza viruses, not just the human. There's influenza A, B, C, and other viruses that are related. And these are complicated viruses, molecularly complicated, and they can reassort their genes. So you have one mild virus that causes disease, or a mild disease, or no disease, but it infects people and is easily transmitted, but it's mild. You have another virus which is severe, it's not easily transmitted, and causes a bad disease, let's say. And the two of them get together in a chicken, reassort, and you have mild viruses, cause mild disease, and difficult to transmit, or easy to transmit. Doesn't make any difference, it's a mild disease, but you also can get severe disease, easily transmitted. That's a problem. And then it spreads to the chicken farmer, and then it spreads to his family or her family, and then it spreads all over China, and then it spreads to Canada and the US, and bad.
So every time it meets up with a new virus, there's a potential for combining. Is that correct?
Sure.
Potential.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why we get vaccines that come out, and the next year it might be a completely different virus.
Right. And
that,
you got to get vaccinated again and again and again.
Wow.
Right now, they're working on some things that are more general, and we hope they work. But there's a vaccine they use in the southern hemisphere that's different from the one up here. Like New Zealand and Australia. They have different viruses. You can tell right away. I mean, most of these things come out of China, because there's so many people in China, and they each have two lungs, and each lung has a lot of cells, and this could be going on in any one of those cells. So the chances that there'll be a mutation is great. And so if you have a virus that's recognized as being a certain molecular constitution, you can make a vaccine against it. But that might not be the case in the northern hemisphere. So they wait and wait and wait till almost the last minute, and then make the vaccine for here. And sometimes they hit it, and sometimes they don't hit it.
This has enormous consequences, I would think, for our agricultural system. And I know that that's not necessarily your area of specialty, but conceptually, an avian flu that wipes out a good chunk of the turkeys in North America that might be a slightly different flu next year, it's a massive impact on agriculture, food production,
Right.
on an ongoing basis, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm. Expensive. Price of turkeys goes up. Got to change the vaccine. Got to get a new vaccine. New vaccines cost more than the old vaccines. That kind of, plus all the dead turkeys.
So it's not just the turkeys, but it's any bird that might fly. I'm assuming a songbird flies into the turkey farm.
Ducks and geese, migrating birds, carry it from continent to continent.
So is there any way to stop that kind of transmission really effectively?
No.
Wow. This is our new reality then.
It's been going on for years. not a big problem. Not any bigger than Ebola or Zika.
So Ebola is one of those viruses that I'm assuming has evolved differently. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a virus that is easily communicable through touch and spreads very quickly, but used to kill off the transmission pool before it could spread quickly. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Probably still does.
So
I don't know where it comes from. It's possible that it's from bats.
So
And they're not affected by it. Bats are not affected by it very much.
I had heard that maybe SARS was bat transmitted too. So how does that go from bats to people?
Feces maybe, or people eating bats. I mean, lots of people eat bats in Central Africa and in other parts of the world. And so handling them before they're cooked.
So bushmeat, that's why bushmeat was an issue. There's a commonality between transmission between humans and non-human animals here. It seems like the viruses like this host relationship.
Well, it's not whether they like it or not. They don't have personalities. It's whether they can adapt to it or not. But the Ebola virus has a protein that suppresses the immune system. That's a nasty virus. And that's what HIV does. Totally different virus. But if you get infected with Ebola, the first thing you ought to do is make antibody early. This suppresses that. So you're going to die. Probably.
You can't fight
Some
back.
people don't die. Don't know why.
That's the thing to study. Because then it seems to me like our best fight against the viruses is to figure out how to make your immune system fight for you.
Well, when a virus gets in you, you can't expect your immune system to simply focus on that virus. It's over in one part of the body, and, immune system is all over the place in that part and somewhere else, but it can sequester somewhere, start replicating or multiplying, and then it's got a head of steam, and then it's a fight. That's when you get sick.
In terms of management of the thing, or your experience with
Thing?
Of disease, I'll use Hanta as an example. We have a tendency to say hantavirus occurs in rats and mice, or in mice. If we kill the mice in rodents, okay. Is it universal? Rats and mice, both of them can get Hanta?
No, it depends on the virus. Some of these viruses replicate in rats, and you can adapt the viruses to replicate in lab animals, so you can study them. Rats, you can use lab rats, or you can put them into mice, and some don't infect closely related rodents.
So if you reduce the populations of rodents within your area, is there a direct correlation between the reduction in disease?
Sure, you get rid of the rodents, you don't have any virus. That isn't possible, though. They can't even get rid of the rats in the subway in New York, or in the apartments where they bite children.
Is there a direct correlation in your mind with population density, do you think?
There always is. There's nothing you can do any more than what we already do, which isn't enough. They could get rid of all the rats in the subway in New York if they spent billions of dollars doing it.
Okay, I would love to hear I asked about distance, you were saying.
Evolution occurs on a gradient, and sometimes it's a distance gradient. And when the first hantavirus cases occurred, they occurred on an Indian reservation in New Mexico. southern New Mexico. And they got virus from the patients. I mean, they didn't isolate the virus, but they got the genome out and eventually got the virus out. But the first virus was actually isolated in California. Same virus, with some variations in it. And so they wanted to try to get the virus to grow or replicate in deer mice, which would be easier to handle than inoculating humans. It's hard to get permission to inoculate humans. So they got some mice from the area and tested them, and they didn't have, some had virus, some didn't have virus. The ones that didn't have virus, they took back to Atlanta and inoculated them to get the virus to grow, and it didn't grow. And they said, something is wrong here. You know, we know that the virus is here. We know it's in deer mice. So there's a colony of mice, of deer mice, in South Carolina at the university. And they got some of those, and the virus didn't grow in them. So they asked, where did those mice come from that started the colony? They were from Michigan. So they eventually got virus from Michigan, and the virus grew fine in them, but they didn't grow in the New Mexico mice. And it turned out that the virus from Michigan is, again, slightly different from the virus from the mice in New Mexico. The further away you go from any one site, the more differences there are. Little differences. Little, bigger, bigger, bigger. And finally you got to say, this is not the same virus. It's different virus. But it's very difficult to say where along the line it's now different and needs a different name. And it turned out that there are lots of viruses that are related to sin nombre virus, which is the etiologic agent of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. But they cause hantavirus pulmonary syndrome in humans. Rare. There's Blue Mountain or Blue Ridge or Blue something or other virus, which is in Pennsylvania. You know, they had a couple of hunters who slept in a cabin and got sick. And that virus is just as different from the New Mexico virus, relatively speaking, as the mouse is up there, Blue River virus, as the mouse is from the mice in New Mexico and the mice in California. It turns out that this is a virus which is essentially one host besides humans. Kills humans, doesn't make the mice sick, but the deer mice are susceptible to the local virus and only the local virus. And if you go distance, those mice are susceptible to the local virus there. Although the viruses are the same, they're not exactly the same. And the mice are the same, and they're not exactly the same. So they must have evolved together over the years. And those, I mean, we got virus from mice in various places that are slightly different, and we found them in different rodents. But the rodents are closely related genetically to the deer mouse. So you have some spillover, they call it, once in a while to a different host, but it doesn't sweep through those populations and dies out eventually. There's a definite relation between geography and distance genetic distance between the rodent host and the viruses.
If I'm understanding this correctly, then animals that have developed in different regions might have resistance or susceptibility based upon just strictly distance.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's based on the mouse genetics.
but they haven't necessarily, I always thought it would be the opposite. The exposure, the resistance would be higher in certain areas that have been exposed to that. But it makes sense that
No.
the virus would evolve as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the virus evolves in order to be able to impact the animals in its region.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that
Doesn't impact them much. It just has found a good way to get along. And viruses do that. Bacteria do that. Parasites do that. Everything infectious does it. You know, there are people who say the microorganisms are going to outlast us. The only thing going to be left are cockroaches and their viruses.
If you liked our podcast, please subscribe. This is how we keep going. And please tell your friends to join us. Please feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have to our social media sites. Our Twitter feed is at Backyard Green Films, spelled BKYRDGREENFILMS. Our Instagram is at Backyard Green Films, BACKYARDGREENFILMS. Our Facebook is Backyard Green Films. Our YouTube URL is youtube.com/Backyard Green Films.
We'd like to thank Dr. Calisher for sitting down with us today. If you'd like to find out more about Dr. Calisher, please visit our show notes where we'll have links to some of his papers and more information. Also, we highly recommend that you look into Dr. Calisher's book, Lifting the Impenetrable Veil, From Yellow Fever to Ebola Hemorrhagic Fever and SARS. It's available on Amazon.com. You have been listening to Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Please tune in for more upcoming episodes from our travels. I'm Rick Bowman, your behind-the-scenes editor. Until next time. This has been a presentation of Backyard Green Films Productions, all rights reserved, copyright 2020. Also, we highly recommend that you look into Dr. Calisher's book, Lifting the Impenetrable, is that right? Impenetrable? Okay. Lifting the Impenetrable Veil, From Yellow Fever to Ebola I can't say all this stuff.